So hi everyone who is either you who might be watching us from all over the world. Today we have a sort of different Check Out Basic Income podcast episode for two reasons. One, because I'm here on my own. We don't have Roswitha, who usually does the interviews with me. But I think the main reason is that we are doing a live stream. So for the first time, our episode is going to be live streamed. So I'm a bit nervous. Hopefully the person I'm going to be talking to, Patrick, is not as nervous as I am, but it's a special reason for that to be happening today. So Patrick is at COP30, which is taking place in Belém, Brazil. Maybe some of you know about this already. We'll get to have sort of, I hope, inside information of how the COP is going, but also Patrick has a lot of things to tell us about basic income and particularly how basic income can be relevant within the climate and ecological crisis that we are living. So let's jump right into it. I'm so excited to have Patrick talking with me today. Maybe, Patrick, you can start by introducing yourself to our audience. I think a lot of our audience already knows you, but maybe you take a few minutes to do that.
Sure, amazing. Thanks, Katarina, and great to be here joining you from very warm and very wet Belém in northern Brazil at the gateway to the Amazon rainforest. Yeah, I haven't done one of these podcasts with you before, so live is all I'm used to. So I'm hopefully not too nervous. I used to be in politics, and I did quite a few live radio interviews and so on. The pre-records were always much easier because our press officer always told us, if you mess up a pre-record, just say a swear word and then they can't use it and they have to re-record it. But of course, you don't have that option when you're live. So we just have to muddle through and try not to swear. Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me on, and hello to everyone listening in. So I'm the executive director of Equal Right, which is a UK-based nonprofit organization, but we work globally. We have staff in Asia, Africa, Latin America. We work to advance climate justice, equity, and human rights through the advocacy of universal basic income. And we're particularly interested in the intersection of UBI and climate policy. I suppose our vision as an organization starts with the belief that everyone in the world has an equal right to a share of the world's wealth and resources, but that wealth and those resources are very inequitably shared, and that having a basic income is one way to recognize that right. But it's also a way to catalyze and build a foundation for the recognition and empowerment of other rights and human capabilities as well. So we've been working in the climate space for a few years now, trying to really look at the different ways in which we can embed UBI principles, unconditional cash transfers, and related financing mechanisms with the climate agenda, with the UNFCCC agenda as much as possible. And that's what brings us here to Belém for COP30.
So we are very interested in hearing about your particular take on basic income. We'll go into it. Particularly this, I thought it was interesting how you framed the possibility of basic income anchoring many other rights. So I'll ask you some things about this. But before we do that, so as I said, this is an orthodox podcast because it's done live, and it's because you are at COP30, which is a very, or one can hope, extremely important event. So can you tell us why is it important for you, but also for Equal Right, to attend COP, and what do you think is at stake in this year's edition?
Yeah, I mean, for us as a small player, a small organization, the primary reason we're here is to be a part of the conversation, to meet with key partners, organizations, so governments. We've been working with governments in Colombia and Malawi, for example, to meet with project partners. We're developing projects with that we maybe wouldn't meet ordinarily, or it'd be very difficult to travel to go and meet. And also there are thousands of events happening, not just in the venue and the nearby green zone, but also right across the city of Belém. Incredibly hard to keep on top of all of them. But they are very good opportunities to meet key people, to network, and also often to ask questions and have a space to put across your own ideas. Last year, we took part in 2 or 3 events at COP. This year, I think we have 11 events, including 3 tomorrow and 3 on Friday. So we're really ramping up our presence at COP. We've got formal side events. We've got events in the pavilion space, which is where countries and other entities can rent a dedicated space in COP. And those are really good opportunities to get your agenda across and really try and share our ideas on basic income in the discourse at COP. But I suppose in terms of the big picture, well, first of all, like my take on the ground, I think the word that's been thrown around the most the first few days is chaos. I mean, we arrived here on Monday morning when COP was meant to start, and we could still see there were stud walls for some of the pavilion spaces being built. So everything is like incredibly last minute. I think, the WWF pavilion, the Columbia pavilion were still being built when we arrived on Monday, which is quite funny. They ran out of coffee on the first day in the coffee places, and I'm sure anyone who's been to these events and drinks coffee knows how important that is. I've got mine here. Thankfully, it's back. I also heard a rumor that they started using decaf instead of regular coffee because they ran out of the regular coffee and they were giving us that. So I think the word that I heard over and over again is this is chaos. They've got this incredibly bureaucratic system for payment as well, where you have to get a prepaid card and you have to go and find someone with a yellow t-shirt to put money onto this card, and then you use the card to pay, which is fine in principle, but you have no way of knowing how much money you have on the card. There's no app or anything like that. So you have to go and find these people to check how much money you have left. So you end up queuing for half an hour for a coffee, you get to the top, and then you have no credit left on this card, and you have to leave the line and go and top it up again, which happened to me yesterday. So yeah, it's all a bit chaotic. I think Brazil generally loves its sort of idiosyncrasies and bureaucracies when it comes to buying things and so on. So I think that's all part of the cultural experience. But of course, the important thing here is we're here in the backdrop of the climate crisis. We're here in the Amazon, one of the regions most affected by the climate crisis. One of the key things of this COP is hearing the voices of indigenous communities. Brazil has the largest population of indigenous peoples. Last night, a march led by many indigenous groups across Brazil actually stormed the venue here to put across their agenda, to voice the fact that they weren't being heard at COP, which I think is fair enough. It's a very sort of bureaucratic, high-level elite process, and it doesn't necessarily create the spaces for that bottom-up grassroots engagement. So hopefully the world is listening and paying attention to indigenous peoples. The People's Summit is launching in another part of the city today, which is an incredibly important civic society movement that Equal Right will have people present at as well. I think the agenda in terms of the what we hope to get out of COP remains similar to Baku last year. Climate finance is the most important thing, and particularly how we can operationalize and realize the commitment that was made in Azerbaijan at COP29 last year around the road from Baku to Belém, the roadmap from Baku to Belém, sorry, which commits countries to trying to secure 300 billion in climate finance by 2035. But with a sort of stretch target of 1.3 trillion. And at the minute, we're nowhere near that. The financing gap for adaptation work alone is 300 billion. So massive chasm there to fill. And there's not really any clear mechanisms or proposals coming out on how we meet that, unfortunately. There's the TFFF, which is really interesting, which is a forest finance facility that has been put together by the Brazil government, hosted by the World Bank. And I can maybe get into that in a little bit in another question, because it's quite an interesting one, possibly relevant to basic income. And a lot of civic society organizations are calling for the BAM, which is a nice catchy name. BAM, which is the Belém Action Mechanism on Just Transition, which is a new institutional arrangement intending to try and capture all of the work related to a just transition and drive it forward. And that's a big civic society call that is happening at COP. Whether or not that happens or not, I don't know, but we're optimistic. It's still early days. I heard that the UK government, my government is not too supportive of it, unfortunately, so that will be challenging, but we'll see. The UK government has its own problems at the moment for anyone who's been following British politics in the last 24 hours.
Quite a big problem, yes. I thought it was very interesting. So one, the general chaotic aspect of it. So I was reading of some people arguing that in a way, the potential for chaos was nice because it was the first COP that is actually being held in a place that is underdeveloped is the right word, but it's a challenging city that has a lot of inequality and also a lot of poverty, and thus the infrastructure is not exactly in place for the sort of amenities, coffee and otherwise, that we often expect. So I guess it is interesting to see how much that can play into expectations or even shape expectations, given that in many ways we know that at least in the global north, we need to change our lifestyles. But I also thought it was first, thank you for telling us and giving us an overview of what might be at stake. But it was nice to hear that you've noticed an evolution of equal rights presence at COP and that you are now much more involved. So I guess let's to segue into basic income. Maybe can you start by telling us whether you think this implies that basic income is more on the climate justice agenda? And then tell us a little bit more about how you see UBI in the context of climate justice and equal rights.
Yeah, I definitely think it's more so on the agenda. People aren't necessarily saying basic income, but I think that the conversation around cash transfers, unconditional cash transfers, is happening more as people realize that maybe market-based disbursements or conditional payment for ecosystem services and so on programs are not necessarily getting to people at the scale or the efficiency that they need to really solve the problem. Was at a really interesting launch of a report yesterday by Esther Duflo, who's the Nobel laureate, author, economist for economics. And she and some colleagues have launched this, I think they're calling it the Grand Bargain. And it's a proposal for a new form of carbon tax, carbon trading system that would redistribute direct cash transfers in part. There's some infrastructure spending, but about 70% of the money raised would go towards direct cash transfers in developing country contexts. There's a little bit more detail to it, like it might be ramped up in cases of like heat waves or floods, so it might be more of a dial up, dial down basic income. But it's very interesting that that she was proposing that because it's very close to the cap and share proposal that Equal Right has been talking about for several years, which involves a cap on global fossil fuel production, so a firm limit that would keep us within a certain temperature pathway, 1.5, 1.6, whatever. And then a charge on all of that fossil fuel that is used, and that charge is paid by countries. And the money from that charge goes into a global fund and disperses climate finance and a universal basic income. So her proposal was somewhat similar, adjacent to cap and share, and she's obviously a massive name in these spaces globally. So very good to see these ideas taking shape. But I was also in a panel yesterday with a lot of indigenous leaders on alternatives to carbon markets, and I got up and asked a question about whether conservation basic income or basic income generally had been considered as an alternative, and they weren't familiar with it. They thought, we like the idea of it, but we don't know enough. We need to have a conversation, and we did have some conversations, which was great. But I think that if we are going to make basic income happen meaningfully in the climate space, we need to start having those conversations from the grassroots with indigenous peoples and local communities and start saying why a conservation basic income or an indigenous basic income is a better alternative to carbon markets or payment for ecosystem services programs. And that's something we're trying to do through the Cash for Conservation Group, which is a network that Equal Right has founded along with Give Directly and Cool Earth. And we've got a global network of academics, of NGOs, and some indigenous organizations as well. And we're really trying to build this conversation around cash for conservation, conservation basic income, unconditional cash broadly as an alternative to these conditional and market-based mechanisms. And we're having a lot of success with that. And we've got a side event tomorrow with C4 ICRAF and the Brazilian government. Give Directly is involved in organizing that along with us as well. And a lot of other spaces too, with the government, DRC also. So I think that we're definitely starting to get that on the agenda. We just published a paper actually on basic income for just transition, which maps out all of the different ways that we feel a basic income could help advance the UNFCCC agenda. Like talk a bit more about that if you'd like. But I think we're definitely making headway. Can
you briefly explain, so a lot of people might not be familiar with what a UBI for conservation is, or how do you frame what an indigenous UBI would be? Can you tell us one, what those are, but also why do you think they are superior to both conditional mechanisms, but also what you said, like carbon markets and market-based systems? Because I think it might be interesting for people to know what the differences are.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, starting backwards in terms of the definition of those terms, payment for ecosystem services, there's lots of different approaches to it, but very simply, it is paying a community generally for conservation activities. So that might be restoring forests, protecting grassland. It might be doing monitoring activities, whatever, a whole bunch of stuff. But they receive a payment for that. So it's a conditional scheme. It's essentially they are providing a service. And those are usually publicly funded, but a lot of NGOs do them as well. And then market-based mechanisms, so those are carbon credit programs. So, for example, Netflix buys a carbon credit, a voluntary carbon credit to offset its emissions. Those emissions are offset by some sort of carbon sequestration activity, often in the global south. So that could be a reforestation project in Colombia. So carbon credit developers will go in and develop these forest projects in Colombia, and then essentially through a market mechanism, sell the credits back to Netflix or Google or whoever. So that's how the market aspect comes into it. And there's both mandatory and voluntary markets. But the problem with those programs, and there's a massive scale here. There's some that are, led by local communities, and there's some on the bad end where you basically have carbon cowboys coming in and buying land up at very low prices or forcing communities off land, doing their project and then taking the profits. So it can be very extractive. It can be a very extractive economy, actually. And one of the other challenges is that these carbon credit programs are often not shared widely, the benefits of them. It's usually the landowners, it's often the elites in the existing communities, it's the people who can navigate this very financialized and bureaucratic system, right? And that's often seen for payment for ecosystem services. It's the people who are organized, who can come together, who can negotiate with governments or NGOs to say, right, we'll do this service for you. And we know as basic income advocates that the people who are most vulnerable in society, who are least able maybe to navigate these state or financial systems, are often those who are most in need. And one of the reasons why basic income is superior is because it would reach everyone without these conditionalities, without the need to jump through all of these hoops. In terms of what a conservation basic income or indigenous basic income is, I mean, those are still fairly broad concepts, right? Every country might have a way of recognizing what is indigenous, whether that is a register or a particular area. Conservation basic income, again, can be much wider, and there've been a few modeling experiments looking at what this could look like globally, looking at conservation areas in just the global south or in the entire world. So that can be interpreted quite broadly. But there are some cost estimates. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but in terms of what it would cost to do a conservation area basic income. In Brazil, we've looked at what an indigenous basic income might look like, because they do have quite good recognition for indigenous groups. And that's something that we feel could be an obvious step for the government to take towards a full UBI. So if they didn't do a national UBI, they could start with providing it to all indigenous peoples. And I think it's crucial that we frame that not just in terms of maybe the poverty relief aspect that a lot of basic income programs often are, but actually as compensation for loss of land, loss of forest that has been extracted and taken away from these communities over decades, but also the role that these communities have played for centuries in protecting these forests and protecting these ecosystems. And actually the basic income can be simply a form of payment or reward for this unremunerated work that they are currently doing to keep us all alive. The Amazon is the lungs of the world, right? So I think that there's a lot of different ways in which you can frame it. I think as well, there's a very important conversation, especially in sort of peripheral communities, communities on the edge of the rainforest who are perhaps more reliant on extractive industries, mining, forestry. But often the local people in those communities don't have the power to say no to big extractive capital when they come knocking and they say to these communities, oh, well, we'll give you X amount for your land if we can take your trees. And these people can't put food on the table, right? And you're going to prioritize putting food on the table before you say, no, on principle, we are not going to let you have our land. And there's a lot of great work being done by NGOs. Cool Earth, one of our partners, does this in Peru, and they help communities. They give communities money so that they don't have to sell their land. And that's one way to ensure land tenure. And a basic income can be complementary to those type of systems, because the individuals who might go and sign up to work for a logging company can now receive a basic income instead, and they have an alternative, because their culture, their tradition, everything they've been doing as a community says no, cutting down the trees are wrong. But also, ultimately, if you are in a state of poverty, these are very much peripheral, marketized communities. They still need a monetary income. They still need to put food on the table. Then that may be the only option open to you to earn a living.
Super interesting. So it means that we can choose not only different models, but also seems like you're saying that we can choose different justifications. For certain cases, we might be talking about compensation for unremunerated work that should be done by all. For other instances, you might be saying we are providing the resources for them to enact their own values or principles. In other instances, we are talking about a system that reaches everyone, namely those vulnerable. So it kind of seems that UBI is inherently linked to a particular notion of justice. So you would say that for you and for equal rights, there's a link between the fight for climate and some account of justice, and UBI fits right into that aspect, or how would you frame it then?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, the clue is in the name. We're a rights and justice oriented organization. We believe that UBI is a right and not just a mechanism for poverty alleviation or whatever. And that it's a tool. It's a tool to provide autonomy, to build capacity, to enhance other social, economic, and ecological rights. The example of the power to say no to these extractive industries, for example. And I think one of the beautiful things about UBI is its flexibility and dexterity, and how it could be applied in so many different scenarios to a particular local context, but it's still ultimately the same mechanism, and the framing and the modality, the distribution mechanisms may change from place to place. And we're in the Cash for Conservation group, we're looking at this, like what makes more sense in, say, traditional indigenous community in the Colombian Amazon, where Equal Right is working at the moment with Cool Earth to develop a project, and we're having those conversations with indigenous communities, versus, say, maybe the DRC, where communities have fled urban areas affected by conflict and have moved into the forest and are now reliant on the forest for a livelihood, which creates more conflict. So where can a basic income come in and actually alleviate some of that conflict? Or then in Kenya, we're developing a Climate Commons Fund, which is a project that would provide an annual cash transfer climate dividend to a existing community conservancy of around 200 people in Laikipia in Kenya. And that project is really around catalyzing and rewarding existing community conservation and trying to find ways to make sure that the benefits of conservation are more evenly shared. So there's so many different ways, I think, in which you can frame this conversation around UBI in the climate space. And we're only talking really about the conservation space as well, right? Like, we haven't even touched on the role that cash can play for loss and damage, both as like anticipating climate disaster, during climate disaster, and recovery after climate disaster. We haven't talked about adaptation and the role that basic income can play in helping people in India, for example, cope with heat waves and chronic heat. I mean, adaptation is something that very often is done at the individual or household level. We're in Europe. Our adaptation is bringing an umbrella with us when we leave the house. And maybe in India, that's buying an electric fan for your house so that you can keep cool. But adaptation is often an individual action that requires the exchange of cash for some sort of good or service. And that is something that basic income can have a huge impact in. There's also some evidence as well to show that, particularly with lump sum basic income transfers, both in the global north and the global south, people are often likely to invest this in renewable energies or farm diversification, and all of those things can have a massive mitigation impact in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So I think there's so many ways in which cash, unconditional cash basic income, is relevant to the climate conversation.
No, thank you for also raising that point, because I had mostly looked at some of your projects that are very conservation driven and focused, but it's nice to also understand that the challenges of adaptation and mitigation that we are facing and will face can also be aided by implementing a basic income. I think that's important. But now let me play devil's advocate. So I guess you know that a lot of ecologists seem to be against the basic income, contra a lot of the arguments that you're putting forth on how UBI can be relevant for the climate crisis. And one of the main points is saying, well, sure, UBI seems relevant on many accounts, but fundamentally, under a capitalist system or the system where material consumption is relevant, we will drive material consumption, which is something that we should be working to some extent, at least in some parts of the world, we should be working against. So how would you respond to, given your knowledge, both theoretical and empirical, how would you respond to that criticism?
Sure, no, it's a very relevant one, and I'm clued into the debates on degrowth, and I suppose our perspective would be one that we need contraction and convergence. We need contraction and reduction of polluting, ecologically harmful consumption in the global north, and we need convergence. We need a rising of living standards in the global south. But that doesn't mean that it's not black and white in terms of we have to develop in the same way in the global south as we have done in the global north. There can be more reliance on renewable technologies, but that needs to come with funding from the global north. We can't expect global south countries simply to pick up the tab for that investment. And that's where we need to come in as a global north to say, right, we are going to invest in your green transition to ensure that you don't need to develop the same amount of pollution, carbon emissions, and so on that we have. At the same time, there is a huge amount of space in the global north to continue consuming, but to do so in a greener way. I mean, that is true, electrification, moving to electric cars, investing in renewables. That's not to say we shouldn't also reduce consumption in the global north, of course. Totally agree that is something that we need to do. I suppose at Equal Right, our focus has primarily been on the global south and the impact that a basic income can have there. And I suppose that I'm always wary of this argument to a degree, because I worry that saying that we need degrowth can often say to the poor farmer in Kenya or the indigenous in Colombia, you're not allowed to develop, to set up a business, to invest in more cattle or whatever it is. And I think that what's the alternative there? They just stay in poverty. They stay at the same level. So I'm still pro development in that respect, but I feel that a basic income can open up pathways for greener and more sustainable forms of consumption and development in those places.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, especially if we notice how a lot of your focus is on places where growing and consumption is still very important and relevant. So maybe now you talked a little bit about some projects that you have in Colombia and Kenya, and maybe you want to expand a little bit and tell us what those are, color us on what those projects and pilots have been, and then maybe also tell us what has been something that really you've enjoyed about learning from those pilots, things that us who don't know Kenya or Colombia, or maybe we are in Kenya and Colombia, but would like to know more about these pilots, could hear from your perspective on them.
Yeah, amazing. So, I mean, to be clear, we're only delivering cash in one place, which is actually Tuvalu in the South Pacific, which is a very small scale micro pilot where we are delivering monthly and lump sum transfers to a number of climate activists there. And we work through partners to identify suitable recipients, and then we keep in touch with them and we tell their stories. But it's not sort of a quantitative program in any way. And one of the main takeaways there is that the cash helps them meet the cost of living and also enables them to engage in their advocacy. And we have a few that are engaged in artivism, which we think is a really important means of cultural expression. And we also recognize the importance of giving places like Tuvalu the ability to tell its story on a global stage as much as possible. And we think the basic income can play a role in that. That's a country that could be wiped out from climate change, could be submerged because of sea level rise in decades. So a very important one symbolically. In terms of Colombia and Kenya, we are still at the development stage of those pilots. So Colombia would be a basic conservation, basic income. We're calling it a basic income for peace with nature to around 1,000 individuals in the Colombian Amazon. We've been having conversations with communities for the last 3-4 months. The feedback is very positive. There's always a lot of hesitation around, is it really unconditional? You know, is it really just, you just give us the money? There's no carbon credit, there's no market, there's no service that we have to do in return. And yeah, we're saying yes. I mean, that is the design. A lot of these programs will also be sort of UBI plus, so we'll be working in partnership with other NGOs who are already providing livelihood diversification projects or supporting community conservation plans. So we essentially see basic income as a way to catalyze those existing efforts in a lot of places. So it's not just simply dropping money out of the sky. So it is very important that we plan the particular communities that we're doing this in to optimize the design of these type of programs so that they can be effectively scaled. And in Colombia, it's very much our intention that we would do this pilot over 2 years, and we would use the data from that to advocate for a national basic income, maybe for indigenous communities or conservation areas in Colombia. And we're actually working with members of the Congress there on a basic income bill at the moment that we're submitting evidence to. And hopefully after next year's presidential election, fingers crossed we get the right government, that can then be brought forward. And in Kenya, it's earlier again. We've got a little bit of seed funding from the Global Resilience Partnership to develop this idea of a Climate Commons Fund, which is a very radical and innovative financial instrument. We feel that is much better than the TFFs that we're talking about at the minute, where a amount of money would be devolved and owned by local communities. It would make investments, and those investments would pay for a basic income for that community. The amount of the payment would be indexed to ecological indicators. So in that way, it's a cash for conservation scheme that incentivizes positive conservation, ecological activity, but without a hard conditionality. So essentially, everybody still gets the payment, but the payment might go up or down slightly depending on soil health or grassland cover or poaching statistics or something like that. So it aims to incentivize conservation action without hard conditionalities. It aims to find a way to make basic income programs sustainable in a global south context, which has been a big problem for basic income programs across the world, right? Where they're great for 2 years and then they stop, and then there's a cliff edge there for people involved. So we're trying to think about how we can sustainably, and in Colombia, our pathway is legislative. In Kenya, it's more this Commons Fund financial instrument. But we're really trying to think hard about the financing piece as well. So yeah, from those two projects, watch this space. We're fundraising for them at the minute. So if anyone listening is interested in helping us make those projects happen, please do get in touch with us. And we hope to be in a position to launch them next year. But I should say as well, there are others doing these projects. So Cool Earth, one of our partners, has just finished a 2-year conservation basic income program in Peru with indigenous communities there. And that's shown some really positive results in terms of how people use their time and have more time to connect with nature and be involved with community conservation activities. And really live out the Latin America ethos of buen vivir, this word. And in Liberia, Give Directly is in the middle of delivering a project with the Liberian government for several thousand people. Actually, it's quite significant. And the data for that should be coming soon. That's another cash conservation program. So this is happening. Rwanda is another place as well. So it is in the works. It's fairly nascent, but it's growing.
Any things that were very surprising, either positively surprising or unintended consequences that you think are not so positive?
Well, because we're in the fairly early stage, I think that it's hard to say about unintended consequences. We always get this question that pops up that, well, if you give people in the rainforest money, how do you know they won't just go and buy a chainsaw the next day? And it's a question that we don't have a clear answer to, because we're doing unconditional cash transfers, unconditional in terms of receipt and unconditional in terms of how they spend it. So we can't say, we can't go to the chainsaw shop. But I would flip the logic on its head and say, well, what's the alternative to not giving these people economic security? They stay in poverty. They have to hope, beg, and steal to put food on the table. They have to go through all of these complex, market systems and so on. So let's just trust people, and let's put in, parallel support systems to guide them, to help them make the best possible choices. But let's also trust them that they know how to make these choices already. The vast majority of them, right? And there may be some that don't use the money in what we perceive as an optimal way, but generally it is going to be used for what we know people worldwide use basic income for investing in what we need to live and get by. And when it's a lump sum, a larger transfer, we know that they invest in productive assets, they invest in businesses and livelihoods and so on. So I'm not too worried about the chainsaw sort of straw man argument. I think that one of the big challenges that we will face, and we've seen this, we've been consulting with communities, so our projects involve free and informed prior consent, and that's a very important principle for us. So we're not saying we are doing this project here and this is what we're doing. We are actually talking to communities about the ideas around basic income, about the principles of unconditionality, individual transfers, because often transfers are maybe community or household based, and how they would receive the money. Is there a particular payment mechanism that works, like M-Pesa in Kenya, for example? We will use it. Is there a particular time of the year that's better to receive payments? All of these sort of things. So we want to have those conversations, and that takes time, to bring the communities together, to have those engagements. So that's why, we're in that stage at the moment, and that's very positive. But one of the challenges that we face is what I said earlier about the unconditionality. People think that there's a catch. There must be a catch. What if we take this money, down the line, are we going to be asked to do something? Are we selling our land and we don't realize that all of these sort of concerns? And you have to do a lot of work to overcome those concerns, because sometimes simply saying, no, it's unconditional is not enough. So yeah, we're having those conversations to try and make sure that we bring people with us every step of the way.
It's kind of a trust issue, which, given the history in a lot of global South countries of extractivism and colonialism, is not surprising that they would face it. But also very nice to hear your commitment with the agency of a lot of these populations, not only in saying we trust them, that they will make the decisions that are right for them, despite the fact that we might judge them in another way, but also we want them to consent and to be involved and engaged. I think it's always refreshing to hear that, especially when we are thinking about organizations who are in the global north coming and working in the global south. That's refreshing and important. So I think we are getting close to the end, but I want to ask you two more things. So the first is then how, I guess you are asked this a lot, which is kind of boring, sorry, but how do you see the basic income implementation? So do you see it as an inherently local policy, given that you work a lot on local communities? Or do you think that it's going to be something national, or perhaps even something supranational?
Yeah, so good one, because Equal Right actually used to be called Global Basic Income. That's what we were founded as in 2016, and we changed our name for a variety of reasons. But a commitment to a global UBI is still very much a driving inspiration for us, still very much raison d'etre, and we want to design mechanisms, whether that is how you deliver cash at a global level or how you finance it at a global level, that can be truly global in nature. And the cap and share policy that we have developed, that you can find on our website, sets out a global plan for how that would be funded through a global carbon tax. Our founder, Laura Bannister, is currently in the middle of writing a book. We have a publishing deal for a book, the world's first English language book on a global UBI. So hopefully that will come out soon, and that will set out all of the different taxes, levies, revenue raising sources that could be used to fund a significant global basic income above the global poverty level. Part of our reason for trying to push basic income in the climate space strategically is not just because we see the clear connection between climate policy goals and basic income, but also because the climate space is incredibly well organized globally. So there's very few movements that are as well organized on a global scale, that have global institutions, political, financial, civic society, that are working on this. So if you can get basic income onto the agenda in these spaces at a global level and get it accepted, whether that's an indigenous basic income or conservation basic income or basic income for adaptation, whatever, that is one way to build this conversation on that global scale.
You don't think there is an inherent tension on your commitments to bottom up, locally inspired and driven basic incomes, and then the potentialities of a global basic income?
I think you have to build from the bottom up to prove that it works. And that's primarily what we are doing in places like Kenya and Colombia, because this sort of approach, the cash conservation approach, is very new. It hasn't been done on a large scale. So I think you need to do those demonstrations, those proof of concepts. But ultimately, as an organization, we don't want to stay small. We are here to scale. We're an advocacy organization first. We're not an implementing organization, a traditional NGO in that sense. So we don't just want to have a project portfolio dotted across the world. We actually want to look at how we can join up these dots and advocate upwards to have these policies enacted at scale, whether that is through new innovative financial mechanisms like cap and share, whether that is legislation at the national level in places like Colombia or Brazil. And that's where we want to be at. And I think that we need to keep, if we want basic income to be a reality, we need to keep that big picture in mind. It can't just be looking at localized policies in silos.
That makes sense. Great, Patrick. I've been learning a lot. I think before we close, I want to ask you, what are your expectations for the last days of COP? COP in general, but also with basic income. What can you tell us and anticipate on what do you think might happen?
Always hard to know with these things. I think you always have to temper your expectations substantially. So I think for us at Equal Right, it's just trying to see what conversations we can kickstart around these ideas of conservation basic income. So the key political, civic society, financial players that we can get in front of. And this is really the spot to have these conversations. Like last year in Baku, we met officials from the Malawi government, and then we ended up working with them for the first 6 months of this year around co-designing a cap and share policy. And I don't think we could have had that engagement if we weren't here in the space at COP having those conversations. So for us, it's keeping our eyes and ears open. It's pursuing obviously an agenda of events that we have, and hoping people attend those. I think on the macro level, let's see what people have been saying is this feels a bit more like a vibes-based COP. You know, it's in Brazil, it's in the rainforest. Symbolically, it's nice, but is there really much happening? Is there really much meat on the bones there? And I'm not really seeing that. Maybe I'm not paying close enough attention, but I'm not seeing a really clear agenda in terms of the target that people want to get to. You've got this Tropical Forest Forever facility that the Brazil government is launching, which would it's a new financing mechanism to try and provide money for national governments who afforest. But there's a lot of opposition from civic society and other players for that mechanism. So I'm not sure that even will be passed off as a win here. So yeah, we'll see. Maybe it'll be COP31 before we make any progress. It's important to add as well that, you know, this COP is the first COP to happen in the new Trump presidency. We've seen what they've done in terms of gutting international spending commitments to run a steam train through multilateralism. So we're still very much in a state of flux at the UNFCCC and other global forums where they're trying to sort of restitch this world order, look at new forms of South-South solidarity and multilateralism that can achieve the same goals without the backing of a major player like the US. So I think that's part of the reason why there's maybe a lack of clarity and optimism around what can be achieved in this COP.
Yeah, it's not a very particular optimistic time, but it's true. I guess it's nice to hear you saying the potentialities of solidarity of everyone else, given that we know that some of the most affluent and powerful countries in the world are rejecting to do what is required for the climate crisis. Thank you, Patrick, not only for giving us a glimpse of COP, not of Brazil, which would be great, at least for me. I would love to see a little bit of sun and warmth, given that in Europe it's not that sunny, but still for giving us a glimpse of COP, but also the very important work that you are doing to put UBI and the climate crisis together and in the agenda of COP. Thank you. Also, I'm just going to say for everyone, we are linking Equal Rights website on our social media, but also on the links of this video on YouTube. You should definitely check out Equal Rights website, some of their papers and the discussions they have been having, so you can expand on what you learned from this interview. And again, I'm just going to also echo your request, Patrick. If anyone has funds, know someone who can help Equal Right fund some of their projects, please get in touch. That would be great. We need to join forces together. Once again, Patrick, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the days at COP.
Thanks so much, Katarina. Great to join you. Thanks for all the questions.
Thank you.